humans, and welcome back to another video. My name is Lucy and I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham and I study queer romance novels. So I thought today I would do sort of an introduction to romance scholarship video in terms of what books I think you could read if you are interested in studying this subject academically. I have tried to pick books that are general starter ones just to get you interested in the topic. Like maybe you've been reading romance novels for a long time, no shade, I've been reading romance novels since I was like 14, I'm now 27, so maybe you just want to make that transition, you want to think a bit more critically about this topic. This is the video for you. Or maybe you're just nosy and you want to know what books I read. So the first book I want to talk about is Reading the Romance by Janice A. Radway. Now this book was first published in 1984 and is often considered the first critical academic book on romance scholarship that put it in a positive light. There was criticism before this. You start to see kind of discussions of romance novels in sort of academic circles from even the 1950s. If you know, there's a couple of surveys by Mills and Boom. The 1970s, a lot of lesbian or feminist critics or lesbian feminist critics picked up on romance in a particularly negative light, saying how it was damning women to worship the patriarchy and how it was tricking us into this heteronormative state. So Radway was really the first to come along and say, whoa, hold on a minute, maybe there's a bit more going on here with this genre that's so popular with women. They can't all be being brainwashed by these books into worshipping the patriarchy. The core concept of the book is based on a survey that Radway did of a group of women, I believe in Wisconsin, if I remember from when I read this book for my master's. And she does a survey, she asks them a bunch of questions, she interviews a bunch of them, and they're basically this group of regular romance readers who live in this one town and mainly get recommendations through this one person actually who owns the local bookshop or works at the local bookshop. So it is a small sample, it is not necessarily representative of everybody who read romance in the 80s, and it's certainly not necessarily representative of people who read romance now, because the genre has obviously changed a lot, as all genres have in the last 40 years. The reason it is a good place to start, and why most romance scholars still to this day either were introduced to romance through Radway or will go back and read Radway, is because this book is undeniably the most famous outside of romance circles. When you talk to someone and tell them that you are doing romance or studying romance in some capacity, they will probably mention Radway, or they will know Radway. Like, that's their baseline for romance scholarship. So it's important to therefore know what they're talking about. It's also arguably what started a lot of romance scholarship off today. So again, it's important to go back and read that. That doesn't mean now we consider it perfect. It doesn't mean you should hold it up on a pedestal. There are obviously things that have changed. Looking back, there were clear omissions. There is no kind of queer romance back then, despite there being certainly lesbian romance publishers since the 1970s. That isn't mentioned at all. It's a very heteronormative view of the romance genre. But that doesn't mean there isn't valuable lessons to be learnt from there. I'm certainly incorporating some of the methodology that Radway used, certainly in how she looks at surveys and how she spoke to people and how she incorporated her data, the readership aspect. I'm expanding that to talk to readers, authors, and hopefully publishers when I'm looking at queer romance novels. So I think that's a great place still to start if you want to start thinking about romance scholarship critically. A Natural History of the Romance Novel by Pamela Regis. So this book first came out in 2003 when it was published by the University of Pennsylvania, and this is another key text. Most people, it's Radway and Regis, they will be your introduction to romance scholarship, and Regis is often credited with kind of kickstarting modern romance scholarship. Radway published her book, it sat on its own for quite a long time. Not always, there were books here and there that we certainly shouldn't discount, but it had died down again by the time Pamela Regis came to publish her novel in 2003. So what Regis does in this book is she advocates for the creation of a romance canon. And she does this partly to increase the legitimacy of romance novels, but she also does it through comparing them to older tropes. So she talks about the Regency being a really important subgenre within romance, and she looks at Georgia Heyer, who obviously was heavily influenced by Jane Austen. So she kind of makes these more literary parallels within romance, and she does this with a couple of different genres, including Two But Not Limited, sci-fi and crime, etc. And in doing so, she really advocates that these romance novels are worthy of study, that romance novels can be feminist, and that romance novels crucially focus on the heroine's journey, and that they are a story of female empowerment, that they are a story of feminism, and that actually, depending on the subgenre, in different ways, they reflect real worries that women had when these subgenres were popular. Looking back now, we know Regis also left things out, and she herself has acknowledged this, saying her definition of what constituted a romance excluded queer people, and also how she said that romance novels had to end in a marriage excluded queer people, because when it was written, same-sex marriage wasn't legal in many countries at all. Obviously it's become more now, but then that also suggests a very heteronormative version of a queer relationship, and actually you don't have to have a marriage to have a happy ever after in a romance novel anymore. And she's acknowledged this, and I know she's coming out with other stuff, so I'm sure her future things will be more inclusive. If you did English literature as your undergrad, you will be familiar with a lot of the people that Regis calls on. She really traces the history of romance novels from Pamela by Richardson that came out in the 1700s, to Jane Austen, to really modern day examples like Nora Roberts. Georgette Heyer is also in there. So if you kind of like that historical chronological approach, which is also very canonized, this could be a good way to introduce you. And it's very readable. I found myself enjoying reading this, even if I didn't necessarily agree with everything that Regis was saying. Lesbian Romance Novels by Phyllis Betts, which came out in 2009. Now, the reason I've included this is, as someone who's studying queer romance novels, there isn't a lot of scholarship on queer romance novels. There's a growing amount of scholarship on heterosexual romances, on diverse romances in other ways, but the romance scholarship for books, there's a lot of articles I would say, but full-length books on queer romance novels is still quite limited. And certainly Betts was one of the first, I would feel quite confident in saying, to address lesbian romance novels as a long-term project to produce a book about, rather than a chapter or an article here or there. Betts really traces the history of lesbian romance novels in this piece of scholarship. She goes right back to the 1970s and the gay and lesbian rights movement that kickstarted in America, and how that evolved into a lot of lesbian publishing houses of the 1970s. And these publishing houses, she argues, were a really radical act for the time, and they in themselves partly evolved out of pulp fiction that was hugely popular in the 1950s. Even though it often featured queer protagonists, it often wasn't written by or for queer protagonists, if that makes sense. Betts argues that these 1970s lesbian romance houses were a radical act because they gave queer women a form of representation that they controlled. You know, these were romance novels written by queer women, for queer women, and distributed only to queer women. It was a very in-the-know sort of society and group they created. You know, these publishing houses would have reader distribution lists, and if you weren't on that list, you wouldn't get the book. You couldn't necessarily go into a bookstore and find these books. You had to know about them. And she traces it right through to the 90s, when we get to see lesbian representation on TV, all the way through to pretty much when she wrote the book, so the early 2000s, mid-2000s. And it's really interesting from a perspective of chronicalizing the history of lesbian romances. And I would say it does focus on lesbian subculture more than wider queer women culture. It's a starting point. That's what I'd say. Like I've said with the Regis book, like I've said with the Radway book, if you're interested in kind of studying queer romance novels, if you're interested in studying queer female romance novels, this is a good starting point. What it's not going to do is necessarily be as up-to-date and contemporary as, you know, a similar book written in 2020, because times have moved on in the 11 years. This is still one of the only full-length pieces of scholarship, and by that I mean a book, to exist exclusively on lesbian romance novels. So in that sense, really worth a read if you're interested. Romance Fiction and American Culture, edited by William Gleason and Eric Murphy Selinger. This book was published in 2015, and it is a collection of essays looking at how romance novels and American culture have merged over the years, the connections between them. That was kind of the brief the people who submitted essays were given. Now, the reason I'd recommend this is it's a great selection of essays covering a really broad range of topics, from queer romances to how black people have been represented in romances, to Christianity in romances, to BDSM practices in romances. if you have a topic on romance novels you're interested in, you will probably find an essay within this collection you will enjoy. That doesn't mean every single essay will be relevant to you, but I think this is a great place to start, and I personally really enjoyed a lot of the essays in this collection. And now again, this was written with an American context in mind, so if you are interested in Australian romances or Nigerian romances or romance publishing in India or France, something like that, you might not find essays that are directly related, but you might find topics. Like if you are looking at BDSM romances around the world after the fallout of 50 Shades of Grey, there is an essay that will be relevant to you in this collection. I'm not going to go through all the individual essays. If you just want to dip your toe into, because as I said, these are essays, so you can read one essay, you don't need to read the whole 500 page, however long it is, collection. So in that sense, it's a lot more accessible than maybe some of the previous things I've recommended, where you might need to read the whole book to get a full picture. I think the other thing that's quite good about this collection of essays is it is kind of an undeniable fact that romance that we know today, the romance genre, has been heavily influenced by American culture and American publishing, because although romance is a global industry, and it definitely is becoming even more so with ebooks, self-publishing, and kind of the interconnectivity that we're seeing across the world in general, romance that we know today has its roots in American publishing, I would argue. Or maybe not its roots, because obviously that was English writers like Jane Austen, Georgette Heyer, etc. But certainly the boom of romance novels and the kind of contemporary culture of romance novels is very much an American thing that started with the bodice rippers of the 1960s. So in that sense, it's quite a good little introduction because it puts it within that American context, but then it does also broaden it. So the last book I want to talk about is Happily Ever After, The Romance Story in Popular Culture by Catherine Roach. This was published in 2016. So there are a couple of reasons why I want to talk about this one. Firstly, I found it really easy to read. I actually read this before I started my PhD to kind of get me to start thinking critically about romance novels. Roach has a really approachable way of writing. She is both an academic and a romance author. So in this book, she admits this is kind of coming from both those perspectives. And she admits at the start that this book is kind of a merging of those two passions. And I think that makes it so approachable and so easy to read while still being really critical and interesting for a romance academic. And that's kind of the reason I've put it on this list, because if you are wanting to start thinking critically about romances, this is potentially a really good starting point because it's one of the most approachable on this list. It's also very easily available because it was published most recently, and it's not stupidly expensive like some academic romance books I could mention. In particular, the first few chapters of this book are really an introduction to the romance genre, an introduction to it both as a reader and academic. So if this is a genre that you've maybe just started reading, or you've read for a long time but you've never thought about academically, I would say Roach gives a really good introduction to the genre from an academic perspective and kind of sums up everything that's happened in the romance scholarship world when she published this in 2016. She also focuses a lot on female sexuality and how female sexuality has been represented in romance novels, and that's something I'm very interested in because she doesn't just look at heterosexuality and female heterosexuality, which is actually what I did my master's on. I looked at female heterosexuality in romance novels of the 1990s. It was also interesting because she puts female sexuality into the context of queer romance novels, in particular romance novels, kind of as a way to explain their popularity and to see how those two things relate, considering romance novels are mainly read by women and romances became hugely popular, I would say, after about 2014, if not before then. So I could reel off a whole list of romance scholarship here and talk about all of them, but it would be a much longer video than we have time for. Down below I'm going to put 3 links. One of them is going to be a Goodreads list of romance criticism books or non-fiction romance books, basically like the books I've been talking about today, but a much longer list. I found this list useful. Not every single book on there is useful, and not every single book is accurate, because obviously this is a Goodreads list, but it's a good place to start if you want to find more books just as a casual interest. The second link I'm going to put to is a romance scholarship database created by Laura Vivenco. I really hope I pronounced her name right. And this is a wonderful database. It's tagged, it's kept up to date. There's resources on there up to 2021, which are expected to be published. And one of the tags I particularly love, no surprise, is the LGBT one. And it literally has pretty much all the romance scholarship you could want from when they first started talking about it in the 1980s, I believe the first article is, all the way through to 2021. So that is a really great resource if you are, I would say, more academically inclined and want to find articles for a essay, for example. Whereas the Goodreads list is more just casual interest. Although there is some academic stuff on there, there's also things by bloggers and stuff like that, which are a great introduction to thinking critically about romance novels. And the third link is going to be the Journal of Popular Romance Studies. And this is a fantastic resource. I obsessively stalked this journal when I was a master's student, constantly looking for new articles or articles I thought would be useful. It's how I came across a lot of the names in romance scholarship that I now know and read their work regularly. So definitely worth checking out the backlist of issues. So that's a great resource if you want to kind of see the most up-to-date articles on romance scholarship in one place. Obviously, again, not exclusive, but it's, as far as I know, the only dedicated journal to popular romance studies. I hope you found this video useful and interesting, and it gives you a little taste of romance scholarship and some of the books out there that you can read. As always, feel free to leave a comment or a like or subscribe to this channel. And if you want to get in touch with me privately, feel free to check out my Instagram. I'm always happy to answer questions about PhD life or questions about romance scholarship or anything really, as long as they are polite. So with that, I will see you next Sunday. Bye.